So thank you very much, Peter. Thank you. Sally, it's an absolute pleasure to meet you, huh? And it's an honor to be introducing you in this talk. Huh? So I'm going to be very brief because I'm really looking forward to what you have to say. Huh? But I'm going to start with a story. Yeah. So in one of the books that you've written, Sally, in this Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis, you start off with a quote from the comedian Peter Cook. Yeah.
Mm.
And so the quote is, as I looked out into the night sky across all those infinite stars, it made me realize how unimportant they are. Uh, So I use that all the time, Sally. Yeah. When I read this a few years ago, I've been using that quote because I initially studied physics and astronomy was my initial background. But in June, when I was walking through Trinity College in Dublin, there were a few students who were walking in front of me, and you could tell from the conversation that they'd just finished physics. They'd just finished their exams for their degree in physics. And one of them was saying to the other, yeah, I'm really in thinking about what they were going to do now with their physics degree. One of them was saying to the other, I really want to do something practical. I don't want to be doing something theoretical that has no use whatsoever, like astronomy. Yeah. So I don't understand why we studied astronomy in undergraduate. It's absolutely no use. Yeah. And I couldn't resist. I was walking behind them and I was overhearing the conversation. And I couldn't resist. So I said to them, sorry for interrupting. I shouldn't be saying this, but I just overheard you. And I'd just like to tell you a joke by a comedian, Peter Cook. And I repeated that as I looked out in the stars and saw this infinite stars. I couldn't help thinking how insignificant they are. And they just reacted by saying, exactly, that's exactly what we think. So there was no irony. There was no.
Oh, oh no.
So I absolutely love that quote. But in terms of your own work, yeah, and the importance of your own work, and having studied psychoanalysis myself, I think there's two things that I'd point to that really strike me about the work that you do. Um, the first one is the importance of psychoanalysis and the ideas and the, the concepts that psychoanalysis brings to us. I think the importance of your work is that you're bringing that into public discourse, which I think is hugely important. But you do that in two ways. Huh? You do that on the individual level by talking about individual psychology, but you also do it, which is extremely important, in terms of the social level, the way in which social institutions and society and culture can condition us and convince us to think in certain ways. And if I go back to that quote again, that we look at the stars and think of how unimportant they are, I think a lot of your work is about the social conditions that make it normal for us to look at other people and think how unimportant they are. So, so having said that, as I say, it's just a huge pleasure to introduce you, huge pleasure to meet you, and over to you.
Thank you so much. And it's lovely to be with you all. And I'm delighted. Thanks for asking me. There's so much to say, and I'm not going to read something I've written. I'm going to speak. But you do put your finger on something amazingly important, which, joking aside and irony aside, is becoming very, very serious because, as you say, we're losing the irony. And I found myself entitling a paper that I gave a couple of years ago now, which was Love and its Survival in Unbearable Times, because it's really about the survival of love that we're talking about. We're in a very grim moment. So I thought I'd try to introduce my ideas, and mainly the ideas that I talk about in Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis, which has a subtitle, Neoliberal Exceptionalism and the Culture of Uncare. I'd try and say something about some of the ideas in that book, um, and also the ways that they have developed out of that a little bit. Tall order. Um, but I want to start. Whenever I write anything or say anything, I like to start from where I am now, because I think that we live in history, by which I mean, it's an obvious thing to say, but I mean by it Not that we live with history surrounding us, or we think about history, but the very way we think is influenced by history. So every time I think about where am I at the moment in my search for meaning, where, you know, how do I address the culture, what belongs to me and what belongs to external reality, and where are the pressures, and how can I try to stay porous to external reality and engage with it? You know, I'm doing that afresh in the here and now. So I was thinking, taking that as a starting point, I thought I wanted to say the most difficult thing to get across to ordinary folk, because it bounces off people, which is that the climate crisis and the poly crises, because they're all linked, um, uh, we are implicated in them. We are actually implicated in them. And one can have a reaction to this, which is sort of, yes, yes, that's obvious. But I'm actually going further. I'm saying, unless we really understand that we're implicated in them and adding to them, I don't think that we're going to address the climate crisis. I'll call it the climate crisis. Actually, by climate, you know, one can identify different climates. There's the natural climate, which includes physical climate, there's the social climate, and there's the inner climate, you know. But I'm talking about the climate crisis as the poly crisis, but I always keep my mind on carbon emissions, because they are what are driving the really perilous situation we're in. So I want to start by looking at our implication. And I think it's a very, very hard thing to stay with. So most often, when we start thinking about our implication and our collusions with uncare, basically, and destructiveness, you know, all kinds of arguments can be raised. One is, oh, but you're individualizing things. You know, anybody will tell you this is a structural problem. I'm not going to argue with that. It's true. It is a structural problem. Or yes, but that may be true, but I don't know how to think about that. I mean, if we're talking about carbon emissions, you know, where are we? How much more carbon have we got to burn, basically? Because we're not told anything about that. Okay, so how would I even think about that? And actually, the reality is we've already burnt too much. We have already burnt too much. We can see the effects all around us on the planet. Okay, so that's another kind of moment of bewilderment that stops us from actually recognizing our implication. Then we're not given any sort of framework to help us work out how, well, if we're involved, how involved. So, for instance, we're given no culture that helps us to process our involvement. For instance, if we had a law of ecocide that actually regulated gross uncare, that held people responsible for it, and, you know, actually dealt with it, then we'd be able to say, now I've got a sort of a framework that can help me to locate, yes, I know deep down I'm adding to the problem, but I'm not adding to the problem as much as the oil majors, or to this person or to that person or this corporation or whatever. It would help us think about the issue. And then, because we're living in a highly individualized society, which is a cultural thing, we tend to think, and this is very common, yes, 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 but you know, how many billion are there of us now? It really doesn't make any difference. My tiny little things that I do every day, it really doesn't make any difference. And actually, it does. And if you think about, so, you know, for instance, one could think in terms of, all right, if I use that single-use plastic cup, every time I do it, imagine 5 billion people doing it at the same time as me. But what I'm talking about is a way that we find it very easy to escape actually looking at the fact that we are involved with the problem. We collude with it. And so that's the first thing I want to say. And it's in order to understand that, we need a framework. How do we make sense of how we've got to this point? And so psychological roots of the climate crisis is really my attempt to provide some sort of very basic framework to look at how it's come about that we've reached a point of what I would call demoralization, by which I don't mean that we're feeling in despair. A lot of us are. What I mean is that we have become unregulated from our ordinary common sense moral values. Now, my book is really, in large measure, about how is that achieved? How did that come about? So I start out by saying you've really got to look at different sides of the issue. One is the makeup of the human psyche, and you find it reflected at the individual level and also at the group level. They're not the same, but they bear a family resemblance, and they can operate in very similar ways. So we basically, and this is my debt to Freud, really. He's a conflict theorist. He's talking about a way from the beginning of psychoanalysis that actually we are conflicted beings and we have different sides to us. We have a side, and I'm putting it very crudely now, we have a side that reaches to connect, to care, to find meaning, to understand, to go through a maturational process psychically. That's development. And we have a side to us that actually is more narcissistically involved, that puts us at the center of things, and that basically is more instrumental. I mean, this is not just Freud. You'll find these themes echoing back right through moral philosophy and right to the beginning. There's nothing new about it, but Freud talked about it in a very particular way as something going on. It's internalized within us. So, we are in conflict. Now, the issue is which side of us dominates. And here, I argue that this is not a question of individual character. Different people certainly are different. Some of us are more naturally caring than others. Some of us are more selfish than others and greedy than others. Some have suffered trauma, which has added to all this. It's very complicated. But the basic argument is that in order to care, you need to be in a framework that helps you care. Put unbelievably simply, you need to feel valued, i.e., cared about and loved, and you need to be given the space to care. Those are very basic things. And you can have a framework, a society that enables one to care. And part of that, and this is critical, is that it actually also sanctions us when we don't care. So, caring is not something lovey-dovey. It's really hard work. It's taxing. It involves suffering, self-examination, confrontation of one's group where necessary. It involves struggle. But the issue is what dominates, because we're talking about where does the power lie, the caring side or the uncaring side. And that can be true at an individual level, at a small group level, at a family level, or a group level, or a society level. We're talking about conflicts. Now, so psychology is in this right from the beginning. I don't think we can, we haven't got the reason we got a climate crisis is because we've deregulated and we've deregulated our moral sense, so that the uncaring side of us is dominant and the caring side of us is sidelined. So this makes it very, very difficult to consider what I started with, which is that we all bear some implication in this. Because, okay, no, sorry, I'll move on. So what are the frameworks that support care, and what are the frameworks that support uncare? So here I talk about culture, cultures of care and cultures of uncare. And my essential argument is that we've been living through the ascendancy of, in the neoliberal age, of a culture of uncare. It's not the first time it's happened in human history, but it's got very particular characteristics. So, when Margaret Thatcher came to power, she said something very important. She said, my role, what I want to do is change the culture. Because if you want to deregulate the markets and you want to trash workers' rights, you want to ignore your own working class, and you want to move production to poverty-stricken areas of the world, which is what happened during the Thatcher-Reagan neoliberal era, you have to actually bring people on board. Otherwise, they would object. You have to actually radically change the culture in order to get them to tolerate this situation, because it involves treating people badly, treating the planet badly, and you have to make this look okay. So the culture of uncare is what, in psychoanalytic terms, but it doesn't matter, I call a perverse organization. It's like a perverse climate that actually actively encourages, works on us psychologically to encourage our uncaring side and to actively undermine our caring side. Encourages uncare, undermines uncare. I don't want to go into too much detail, but I want to convey something. So one of the things I really stress is that in order is entitlement, because I think that we have a natural sense of entitlement to take care, to love and be loved as human beings, and we mind if we're deprived of that. And we have a different sort of entitlement, which I call narcissistic entitlement, which is to what I call be an exception. And so my whole book is analyzing exceptionalism. And exceptionalism is a power structure supported by a culture that actually says, and I'll spell it out in very crude terms, I am especially entitled. I'm entitled more than the other person or other groups. I am entitled to see myself as special and ideal, above other people, if you like. I am entitled to more than my fair share. I'm entitled to, why? Because I'm worth it. And also, and this is critical, I am entitled to not suffer any moral pangs because of this position. In other words, I am entitled not to suffer moral conflict between the parts of myself that care and the parts of myself that don't care. That can be silenced, okay? So that takes me back to my very beginning. To the extent to which this culture is successful, it will achieve us a situation where we are in the grip of narcissistic entitlement and we're not aware of it, and we don't understand the fracturing that's gone on to our minds and the trouble that we're in, and how neoliberalism not only deregulated the markets, it deregulated people's morals, and it couldn't have done the first without the second. It simply couldn't, because it needed to have us all on board. So So we're in a pickle, really. Now, it all happens at a very, very subtle level. And I find it quite liberating to understand where I've been caught up with the culture. And it needs revisiting over and over and over again. And I don't believe any of us can avoid being caught up with the culture. So how are we doing? I don't want to talk too much. I'm going to talk too much. I'd like just to give you one example that came from this week. So I'm listening to the Today program. The BBC is very valuable, and it's also a great purveyor of the culture of uncare. So what were they talking about? I've lost my thread. They were talking about that's right, they had the business summit, didn't they? Investment summit. And there'd just been the row about P&O Ferries. I can't remember the name of their parent company. And, the trade secretary had said that they were a rogue company, and Steer Karma had said she's not speaking for the government. Okay. So they were discussing that. And they'd started talking about, and Nick Robinson was actually really pressing the representatives on the Today program about, what is the government actually doing? What is it encouraging? Is it encouraging further deregulation when Keir Starmer says we're open for business? And then the next thing was that the question was asked, yes, but please answer the thing about the trade minister and the row. And then it got all caught up with that. So I suddenly thought, I've been captured. I'm now really, all my attention has gone to the little row between Keir Starmer and the trade secretary. And my attention has been diverted from the big picture. And the big picture is we are not being told about what is going on with large corporations actually coming to invest in the UK. I have a background where there's a whole chapter in the book where I discuss that actually, and it's all linked up with why Brexit happened, that actually one of the reasons for that we had think tanks, right-wing think tanks, who were saying there's too much regulation in Europe. We want the UK to be regulation light so that we can bring our large poultry farms here and we don't have to treat them so well. We can come in all kinds of ways with lighter regulation. And actually, we're not being told about this. So I'm thinking my caring side, which wants to understand, which wants to find meaning in the world, which wants to locate myself in terms of possibly understanding what is going on politically, has been captured by suddenly all my attention's gone onto a little row that's manufactured, by the way, because it's all sexed up. And it reminded me of Trump's book, on how he made his money, where he talks about excitable speech. He said it's a very good idea to have excitable speech because it detracts people from what's really going on. Okay, he said it. So this is a tiny example of how I believe that I was captured one morning, and it was a relief to me to see that, but it also made me fed up to think I'm not really being given the information. I'm being given very low nutrition information here to make sense of what is really going on with the investment strategies of our new Labour government. That's just one tiny example. Okay, now very briefly, and then I'll stop because there's so much to say. The culture of uncare is spread right across advertising, media, education. It's everywhere. Okay, and it's designed to block us every time we make progress towards recognizing that we are involved, we're implicated, we're colluding, and we feel sad about it, and we feel sad about the damage that's being done. this is the pathological organization. It stops us in our tracks, it diverts us, and it keeps us angry and blaming, which, if you think about it, a grief model, early stages of grieving are denial, or keeps us in denial as well, disavow, denial, it never happened. And then when we see it did happen, we feel angry. Then we start accepting it and we feel sad. And then we accept it and we want to do something about it. The culture of uncare is designed to block us from actually feeling sad and feeling our own responsibility and working out where we are and we're not responsible, and then what we can collectively do about it. So also in the book, I talk about to wake up to this situation is to find ourselves morally injured, because the way that the culture is determined and the way society is run, it's not as if we can just choose to step out of it. It impregnates everything, and it becomes very difficult. Moral injury is when you are a victim of, and also are a perpetrator within an immoral system. And I could say so much. I don't know. Maybe I've said enough. What do you think, Ian? For starters, would you like to come in, or do you want me to say more?
Maybe I can ask you a few questions, Sally.
Sure.
Maybe I can, yeah.
Sure. I don't want to just,
So, I mean,
actually, maybe just before you start, Ian, if I could ask anybody who's interested in asking a question so that I can have a read through them if you want to pop them into the chat. Thanks very much. Sorry, Ian. Sorry, Sally.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So, Sally, there's three things maybe I was going to ask you about, yeah? So the first
one, yeah.
And maybe we can have a little discussion on this, yeah, rather than just a question and so on.
Yeah, sure.
But one of the things that you've written, certainly in the psychological roots of the climate crisis, and what you're saying there as well, it's almost like these social institutions of uncare. They encourage us to scapegoat others, to deny, to pursue our own narrow self-interest, yeah. And this is all that, to my mind, and I'd mentioned at the beginning, the way that you bring psychoanalytic ideas into public discourse. This brings to mind Melanie Klein and the sort of paranoid, schizoid, and depressive position and so on. But it's also like one of the, again, bringing some ideas in from psychoanalysis. There's the idea of the myth of maturity, that we, in psychic terms, we grow up and we mature and we stay psychologically mature. But of course, the idea, and certainly from Melanie Klein's idea, is that we kind of, we never permanently reach psychological maturity. We kind of hover precariously in maturity until something comes along and knocks us off our self-satisfied perch, And of course, when that happens, the institutions of social uncare are there to reassure us that our infantile thoughts and impulses and desires are actually maturity, So does that resonate with you? Does that make sense in terms of a...
Yes, it does, in the sense that, and I recognize the Kleinian position there. Today's feeling sad is tomorrow's arrogance again, and we make repairs and then we undo them. Okay. Now, I still believe in some sort of maturational path, but it doesn't look anything like what society tells us it looks like. Okay. Because I do think that the ongoing task of trying to separate out, what is me and what is not me. What am I responsible for and what's being done to me? When I have a thought, is that just my individual quirky way of seeing things? Or am I under the influence of something hovering over all of us that I'm not even conscious of? Now, the wrestling with trying to discriminate between these things, to me, is gaining maturity. It's a different way of looking at it. Now, the other thing is that because the culture of uncare is so stratified in terms of who's more entitled than who isn't, who wins, who loses. It's so involved with splitting, and it's so colonizing that actually we are now people who are really interested in finding ways forward. We're now re-looking at, for instance, the infantilization. Small children are much more in touch with their inner indigenous selves. Are we going to put this down? Are we going to say this is something we want to mature our way out of? Actually, I think we need to reconnect with it, because we become estranged from nature, for instance, as we grow older. And when we listen to the small children, they don't make a distinction between people of different color. They don't distinguish between, animals are not worth it and human beings are. They don't make these splitting distinctions. So I think that, we're at a point where I think there's a lot of undoing and a lot of rethinking about what maturity really is. Václav Havel, he wrote about the pre-political, which is the child, who hasn't been so influenced by culture and a destructive culture. So yes, I do think we go backwards and forwards. But I also think that there is something called improvement, and it involves beefing up the structures that help us to care and hold uncare in check. It's at that level that I think, we need it. And can I just say something else? Rather than, it's not just that we talking about the to and the fro. Every time people make an advance, you can see it all the time. People during COVID, they got in touch with what really mattered to them. They were clapping care workers, on Thursday nights. We were all doing it. We recognized what really mattered, and now there's a real assault on that. People got much more in touch with underlying racism. Huge amounts were understood. To me, this is progress. It's actual progress. So, but then the culture sweeps in and tries to undo all that. And I'd like to give, I'm sorry, I'm saying too much. I'd like to give another tiny example. I've been talking to climate colleagues recently, and we've been noticing that it's harder to sustain a conversation with just the people we know. And it's a newer thing, because it's not that they are denying climate change. In fact, they're saying they're in despair about it. And but if you try to talk about anything that can be done or that you're doing as an individual, you'll get shut up more than before. It's quite interesting. The denial is on the up. Now, I think that since COVID, there's been gradually a massive negative shift towards the progress that was being made. And we've seen it happen in cycles with climate, right from like 2009-10. We've watched progress towards rationality and accepting the situation, and then we've seen the kickback. Progress and then the kickback. So this is the political kickback as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I go back to one of the things you just said towards the beginning of your talk, Sally, where you said, was it love and its survival in impossible times? Was that the phrase? Yeah.
Unbearable times. Unbearable.
Yeah. And it's kind of, for me, that links to the implausibility of love as a central organizing principle for society. Yeah, that's completely dismissed. Yeah, we have economic organizing principles, we have practical, but organizing society around the concept of love is just implausible and dismissed. So this brings me to Alain Badiou, who I don't know if you've come across. He's a French philosopher, and he talks about the hierarchical uncaring structures that he argues that have been there since prehistory.
Yes.
And that this is what you're writing about is a particular manifestation, the latest manifestation of this conditions of uncare that we continually put ourselves in terms of social organization. But the challenge, particularly with climate change, because it's kind of a dead stop,
Yeah.
is that the challenge is to reimagine society where it is organized around the principle of care and around the principle of love. Yeah. So I don't know what your response to that is. That this is a historic challenge. Yeah.
It is a historic challenge. It really is, and I agree with you. I mean, I'm not. I'm often taken to be talking about neoliberalism. I'm not. Because I agree with you. I think it's as old as humankind, and this struggle between care and uncare is that old. But it takes a very specific form. But I think that you know, we've watched. I don't think it's only discovering things that are new. I think it's actually people of my age certainly, uh, have watched the whole collapse, gradual and increasing collapse of the structures of care that actually that were put in place largely post-war.
Mm-hmm.
In the US and the UK and Europe and so on. We've watched them be systematically attacked, and we know what the issue is. We know what matters. We know that we have to have an independent judiciary. We know that we have to have a separation of powers. We know that we have to have a form of democracy where it's not just voting every 4 years. It's actually participatory. There are things that we know. We've seen the lessons of what happens when we let these things slide. So, we've watched all this. We need, I think, to really be much tougher about regulation, about actually understanding that care needs protection from uncare.
Yeah.
And and that actually, and we need to have the fight.
Yeah.
Because if you allow very uncaring practices that cause people to suffer, if you do that for the sake of a profit, you will have the gradual destruction of love.
Mm-hmm. So there's a question from Chiara King, Sally, I think that might be appropriate to bring in here, because it is in this historical framing, yeah. And the question is the link back to colonialism, yeah, and how the exploitation of colonies by Western democracies, which is still ongoing, you could argue, but that is also being part of this dynamic of uncare and also of collusion and denial for those of us who live in developed countries.
Completely, and yes, it is still going on in different forms, very much so. I think it's much more in public consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
The colonial project, and it's very interesting that despite all the pushback to resurrect the fantasy of glorious empire and so on, actually, I think since COVID in particular, I think most people understand much more about the British Empire, for instance, and what's gone on. So it's hugely important. It's hugely important, and I'm not sure what I wish the person who wrote that comment. I wish you could say more about what you wanted to say about that. But it's certainly very much part of the picture.
Yeah. So the question was, would you see the link back to colonialism and the focus from then on Western European centric views and the start of this extractive system? And how do you see the global South within this culture of uncare?
Well, I'm very taken with the hockey stick graph, actually. It's very difficult to say where does it start. Industrial revolution, the colonial project. I mean, George Monbiot has just written and co-authored a fabulous book I recommend to everybody on a new understanding of capitalism. It's just come out, where he traces, I forget exactly when, but he traces it to he really goes into it in a way that I think it illuminates things. So one could trace it back to that. I trace my analysis back to the 70s, the 80s, and I do so because my primary focus is always on the state of carbon emissions. Because if we take our eye off that one, we're sunk. We're just sunk in every way. So what you got is you got the planet in the atmosphere. You got the situation going on like this, and then with the Industrial Revolution, it starts going like that, and then in the early 80s, late 70s, it goes like this, and now it's almost going back on itself. Since COVID, it's really become so rampant. So that's why I focus on this particular period to study it, and don't make generalizations. And I'm not enough of a historian to be able to do that anyway. But a lot of these psychological mechanisms have been there in different forms. I mean, another really good resource is I can't remember her name, Elizabeth somebody, on caste, which is very, very interesting in terms of the way you put people into hierarchies, and you can put racism in terms of caste as well.
Yeah.
But caste is more primary than racism, actually. And my analysis is really that when you're an exception, you justify yourself. I am entitled to more, and this is where the global South comes in. I'm entitled to more than you are. Why? Because I'm worth it, because I'm better, because I'm superior, because I'm above you. And with that, I disrespect you, and I make you not entitled, in abject. And that is the basic structure, and you find it in racism, you find it in sexism. And one of the things that I think we're understanding more is that the entitlement is to not have to suffer guilt or material deprivation, but also the guilt, not have to feel bad because you have all these justifications. It's the entitlement to split the world and to fracture the world, because when you do this, when you split in this way and you claim a narcissistic entitlement, your group does, you don't only split groups, and you always split your own mind at the same time, you actually create different worlds in which to live. And in the book, I call one of them living on planet Earth and the other one living on planet Lala. But you create entirely different worlds that don't intersect. And I got this early on in life because I was brought up in apartheid South Africa, and you could see how under apartheid, not only did you have the ideological splitting, but you had apartheid living apart from. You had literally worlds created that don't intersect, so you don't have to be troubled about how that person is suffering.
Yeah.
Okay.
And to a huge extent, that's kind of what's happening in the US at the moment, isn't it? That you've got two entirely different societies living side by side in terms of their worldviews.
It's very complicated, I think, what's going on in America. Very, very complicated.
Could I go back to one thing you said, Sally, about COVID? Yeah, and
Yeah.
it struck me during COVID. We talk about these institutions of on-care and the society of on-care, and also the need to transition towards a society that's based on principles of where love is the organizing principle or care is the organizing principle. In COVID, I got the sense that both of these were living side by side.
Yes.
The on-caring one is usually the dominant one, but certainly here in Ireland during the COVID, you would see people looking out for one another. Yeah, you would see that other society of care emerging from under the shadow, if you like, of the society of uncare.
And it's always there, it's always there. But it really did flourish. I certainly experienced that.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I found interesting and saddening actually was that there was a huge outpouring of love of nature during COVID. And people were, it went a bit crazy actually, didn't it? People were saying, oh, we've got wild animals on the streets and, all the fish have returned to Venice and everything is all right. And to me, it was a sign of how fractured people's minds are and how vulnerable they are and have become, because that people would get in touch with a wish to be in nature, to have something more reparative, but it very quickly got overtaken by something idealizing and manic and quick, the quick fix. And one of the aspects of the culture of uncare is it promotes the quick fix. Nothing must be stayed with, nothing must be difficult, nothing must deepen, there's no sadness, we just make it all right. And then, as you say, these things were happening side by side. You've got the awful prospect thing outlook of people going into nature, into our national parks with their tents to be in nature and idealized nature, and causing havoc there and leaving their litter. And it was also very crazy. But I think there was something yearning in people to find expression that they'd been very estranged from, actually, at the same time.
So that idea that these two are living side by side, a culture of uncare and a culture of care, that they're living side by side, but the culture of care is denigrated and therefore marginalized. In one sense, it provides us with a roadmap for what the transition needs to be. Yeah. So I'm minded. I was just looking. It's Catherine Marsal who wrote the book "Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner." Yeah, which is that underpinning the masculine, economic driven society. There is this other, yeah, but it's marginalized as feminine. Yeah, it's marginalized as lesser value and feminine, and so on. Yeah? So a big part, I think, of the transition is that, yeah, the construction of gender and the relative priorities of what counts for masculinity and femininity. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think, it's not care, it's not care, uncare. It's actually investigating what there is, and I would say greater care, and understanding the implications of not taking care.
Mm-hmm.
Being ruthless in understanding, following, for instance, the European law follows the precautionary principle more than the United States does. Precautionary principle says if you're going to bring a new drug onto the market or a new product, you have to prove it's safe. You have to think ahead, whereas the other way says, no, we will just do what we like, and then you have to prove it's unsafe, and we'll get our fancy lawyers involved, So I think it's a framework that enables care to take place, which also means, this is another really crucial thing that we cannot leave out of the discussion, it's limits. The reason that is actually observing limits. And one of the things that the uncaring exception in us does is it thinks it can get rid of limits with omnipotent thinking, i.e. make-up thinking. Okay, if we hit a real boundary that we cannot cross, that's okay. We'll just disavow it, i.e. minimize its importance, or we'll lie about it, or we'll have fancy magic ideas that it's all going to go away, or, and this is a bit not at the moment, or we'll have carbon capture that's going to solve the problem. It's not, but we have, if we can't respect limits, we're in deep trouble. Now, the reason that my analysis starts in the 70s is it was because about the 1970s that we had a real beginning understanding of the limits to growth. We had Donella Meadows' fantastic work on the limits to growth. And I think that sort of turbocharged the uncaring side to forge ahead. Okay. And the caring side wasn't bold enough, and it was too implicated and too complacent. I go back to my original point. If we don't understand our own complacency in the system, we're not going to solve it. We're not going to build a culture of care.
So there's two more questions that have come in, Sally. Yeah? The first one goes back to COVID. Huh? So do you see a kickback from COVID of an overemphasis on self-care, a strange fallout from COVID, and you sense that self-care is the priority over and above the other?
I find the question, I wish I could know more what's behind the question, but thank you. So because I think it's a very big subject. And I mean, there is something called self-care. I find that, you know, talking about love and its survival in unbearable times, as the times get more and more unbearable, I find I'm having to apply more care of myself and people around me just to keep going, and to make repairs, to you know, to find joy, to, you know, all of that, to do things that feel healthy. Okay, in a very, very mad situation that we're in. So, you know, there's always self-care. It always matters. But there's also a whole self-care industry, isn't there? And it gets commercialized, it gets individualized. And another point I'd like to make is that if we want to take care in terms of really finding meaning and trying to understand what's going on in the climates right now, that I think it's best to do it in groups, because we can support each other, and we can actually allow ourselves to feel very difficult feelings and even find them together, that it's much more difficult to do on one's own, you know. So there's a lot of self-care that needs to go on, and group care, but I'm quite suspicious of many manifestations, including mindfulness. If I could say something about that, one of the things the culture of uncare has done in our era is that for ordinary people, it's tried to persuade us that we don't have minds at all. We have brains and behaviors. And yet the perverse thing is that when it came to working out how to influence us, it took us very seriously. It did the psychology right. It knew that we had minds, and it knew it had to influence our minds. So we've been really shortchanged there, you know. So mindfulness is quite a suspect thing these days, I would say.
I love that phrase, Sally. Yeah? That I think some areas of psychology may be trying to convince us that we don't have minds, we have brains. Yeah? So, so I love that. There's one other question, and then maybe I can ask you one to close out on. Yeah? So the comment here is, "Hi Sally, this is from me, Sinead Mead. Hi Sally, very thought-provoking and important. It's great to see some students in attendance. Would you have any suggestions for how our students and future graduates can help to foster a culture of care?"
I wish we could actually talk to each other because I think, honestly, I'm not sure of what I can say. I think that it starts with conversations. It starts with listening. I'm not sure I can just offer prescriptions in that sense, but it's such an important issue you're raising. I think trying to get a framework where one understands what's happening really matters, actually.
Mhm.
And listening and talking really matters. I'm sorry, I can't answer more than that.
Yeah. I think what you'd said, Sally, in terms of what you were doing in your book about putting a framework for understanding why we have this collusion. Huh? Yeah. I think that's a very important first step. Yeah.
Yeah.
So could I go back to the astronomy theme that we started off with? And Peter Cook's quote. Huh? I think in one of the things that you've written about is kind of a narrative of history. Yeah? So you'd written about modernity, which began with the great journeys of discovery and the realization that the earth was round. But that was followed immediately by this culture of plunder and colonization and pillaging and slavery and so forth. But you said that there was the beginning of a change with the Apollo journeys and the first picture of the Earthrise over the moon, where we were suddenly confronted, with this image of our isolation, that the Earth is the only world we have, and that being a possible turning point in terms of our relationship with nature and with ourselves, in terms of, but then we've been thrown off kilter in terms of the neoliberal turn from the 70s on and so forth. So I mean, is there hope that we get back onto that narrative of what the realization that we came to, or that began to dawn in the late 60s and early 70s?
Well, I think for me, hope comes with the recognition that it is a perpetual struggle, and the trouble is that our culture tries to persuade us we don't have to struggle. We don't have to struggle. We can have the quick fix. So, but as you say, it wasn't just being blown off kilter like a wind that came. It was very, very deliberate.
Absolutely, yeah.
What do we need to do now to have, if you like, a black gold rush? Because we can see that things are limited. It's very, very perverse, and it's increasingly mad, actually.
Yeah, I think, Peter, do you want to come back in? I think we're coming towards the end of our time.
I mean, just wow, guys, absolutely, absolutely. I think I said it earlier on today. It hurts my feelings how smart you are, but it's such lovely, and it's just lovely to hear you guys talk and to sort of help me to work through how I think about the problems that we face, the frameworks, and how you guys think are really, really, really beneficial for a lot of the people here who are looking to make pragmatic change. Some of the stuff within them provides a really good starting point for conversation. I just want to thank you so much. Like I say, it's brilliant to have you both. Thanks to everybody for their questions as well. And I hope everybody goes out and buys your book. Thank you so much from Pitchdrop. Thank you to the Pitchdrop team. Thank you to N Shooter as well. And hopefully I'd love to have Sally back, and I'd love to hopefully bring Ian Hughes's work to you. We're going to be doing a little taped interview with Ian on Saturday, so Pitchdrop will be bringing that to you soon. Main thing, Sally, thank you so much. I can't thank you enough for your book and for your thoughts and for being so generous with your time with us today. And I hope more people will read your book and build on it.
Thank you so much for having me. And it strikes me there's so little one can cover, but the subject of visual arts and design, and how one can is such an important one. We haven't even got onto that. How one can help because to create worlds. Yeah.
Well, that's the next thing we'll do together, right?
Great. And thank you, Ian. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So wonderful to talk to you, Sally. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody. Have a good evening, and I'll see you soon.
Thanks, guys. That was fantastic. Has Peter left us?
Yeah. Has Peter gone?
I think he has.
I think he has, by the look of it,
Yeah.
So,
look
you
forward
happy
to
with that, Sally?
What?
Are you happy enough?
Yeah. I hope so. I hope it's all right. Yeah.
Super, huh? Yeah.
I hope I wasn't just a bit too general.
No, I think no. I think you covered a lot, but the fundamental points are there, huh? Yeah.
People know most of this stuff. I think it just maybe need that, it helps just when people can join a few dots and, yeah.
I'm not sure the extent they do, Sally, huh?
Oh, really?
Because I think I'm working on a project at the moment in University College Cork, huh? And it's really about looking at the social institutions, politics, economics, technology, and essentially that they're institutions of uncare, yeah, and that the sort of the myths or the norms and values that are driving them, yeah. So, for example, you mentioned about technology, yeah. So one of the things that's driving technology is this idea of creative destruction, yeah. That you can
Go on. What's creative destruction?
Creative destruction is that you put out the technology, it's going to create a lot of havoc, it's going to create a lot of unemployment and so on, but that's how progress happens. Yeah. It's
Oh,
unapologetic. Yeah. That's
yeah,
how progress happens. Yeah.
yeah,
And so similarly in terms of, the myth of growth in terms of economics, and there's no other conversation we can have. If you're thinking about uh, post-growth narratives, you're not really being serious. So I don't think people do get this. I think people are largely still working within the paradigm of incremental change. Yeah.
yeah.
Not fundamentally thinking that these structures are foundationally flawed. Yeah. So I think that's where your message is so important, is to bring people back to the roots and say, really, these things are totally, as you said at the end, yeah, they're creating a madness that we're living within.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
You know?
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've just been changing the subject a bit, but I've just been reading a bit more about Adorno
Mhm.
and I've been thinking, he's brilliant actually,
Yeah.
but they all are. It's so masculine philosophy dominated, and I think until some kind of more feminine principle is brought into this thing, it's not going to work either.
Yeah. 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 What about Hannah Arendt? Does she help?
Yes, I mean she's wonderful. They're all wonderful, but I just had that thought about it. That
Hmm.
it's a very gendered thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know how one progresses this, because people get very scared if you just say, well, everything's got to change, and they need stepping stones.